Hi there, so this is the second of the videos that I wanted to try and do today, Friday. I'm trying to catch up a little bit of myself, so I had kind of like a 2-week break there. I got distracted by Champions League, my team Aston Villa, and a bit of my trip back to London where I brought books but I didn't particularly finish them on the road. And I managed to finish the second book that I wanted to try and get to. So, as flagged up in my last video, it's another non-fiction, and some people may groan that it's yet another history of the Second World War, Third Reich, etc. book, which is one of my kind of topics. And it is Richard J. Evans's recently published Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. So what he does in this book is he takes, who starts with Hitler, but then he has what he calls the paladins, the senior figures, then he has the instruments, and then he talks about the enforcers. And so the idea is we go from essentially everyone from, he leaves out Bormann because he doesn't feel there's really enough to say about Bormann, in contrast to Joachim Fest, who he has great admiration for but is very critical of. So if you read the Face of the Third Reich, he has some differences with that. And so we go from everyone from kind of Röhm to the obvious candidates like your Goebbels and your Heydrichs, etc. And we have a relatively unknown general, Leib. We have then we have some ordinary perpetrators and citizens. We have Leni Riefenstahl, and a couple of, maybe 18 months ago, I finally did get to watch Triumph of the Will, which I do think is a very well-made film in terms of the dynamism, and it just strikes me that possibly every single documentary I've ever seen about the Nazis includes some footage from that, which is kind of interesting. I also watched Olympia a little bit later, which is extremely innovative, isn't it, in terms of what she invented a lot of ways of recording sport that we still use today, which I think is interesting. But okay, she's just one chapter among many, right? I think there's 22 profiles. And what do I think? So I would not read this again. Oh, I think it's interesting. I think it's well written, and it's very well researched, and he's a very, very, very good historian. And he's certainly a very good historian and commentator on this aspect of history. And he has a very interesting dialogue with not just with Fest, but with Goldhagen, Daniel Goldhagen. When I moved to New York in late 93, early 94, one of the first books I bought, because it was just recently published, was Goldhagen's book about the, which essentially says the Germans, and he was insistent on calling the Germans all the way through. The Germans killed so many people because they had an element of ingrained exterminatory anti-Semitism that enabled them to move to doing that very, very easily. And of course, the great contrast with that is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, which both of which I think are tremendous books, very, very, very interesting, very well done. And Evans has commentary and reactions and rejections of both of them. He also has quite an interesting restatement of the banality of evil argument, which he feels people like Cesarani have perhaps gone too far in undermining and questioning, and I think that's quite interesting as well. And there's lots of different strands of historiography, ways of analysing and understanding the Nazi Zeit that he brings into play. So this is a very respectable, great mainstream historian dealing things with care and attention. The central sort of thesis of the book, the hook to make you buy it, if you want to be crude, is that we think we know an awful lot about these people. Well, lots of new research has come through, and we find out there's new things to be said and new things to be thought about them. And to a certain extent, I go along with him, and I agree that there are new things to say. He establishes this very quickly in his the first chapter of a Third Reich personality that isn't Hitler, is Röhm, and he very convincingly argues that we have this sort of picture of Röhm as this complete street thug and just crudeness personified, really. But this was completely inaccurate, because he was actually a very typical officer class, cultured. They all seem to play the violin. Maybe more of them played the piano. No, that's not true. I think Eichmann was a piano player. I'm sorry, it's a poor joke, but he's very conscious of the Rome was not like that at all, and that we've radically oversimplified our understanding of him. And okay, sure, great. I think I kind of get a little bit of a different view on his portrait of Goebbels and his and of Goering, and I think a rather depressing statistic is that according to my scales, I'm 3 kilos, only 3 kilos lighter than Hermann Goering was when he was captured by the surrendered to the Americans, which is very, very depressing, and is possibly the subject of the next video, the video after next. But anyway, and so yes, great. But I did find a lot of the material not boring or repetitive, but familiar to a greater or lesser extent. And really, it was only towards the end of the book that I felt he was starting to kind of break fresh ground, really. There's a theme and an argument that goes all the way through the book, which is essentially the only one that matters, which is why. Why were these unspeakable events and atrocities so easy to get committed, to have? There was no, I don't think he doesn't say this in this book, this is a well-known statement, isn't it? They had no problem finding people to carry these things out. He doesn't really go with Goldhagen, but at the same time he's very skeptical of Browning's. He says that, and I don't know, I've not read this scholarship, that Browning's essential thesis is incorrect, because the guys in the police battalions were actually chosen very carefully and were indoctrinated and were even SS membership candidates, and they were far from being ordinary men, and were sort of predisposed. And he kind of circles around this, and the answer that comes through, if there is a consistent story, which I'm sure he would say he's trying to say, is that it was a very unusual. There were certainly elements in middle class and upper class, nationalist, imperialist, authoritarian German society that was very unhappy with the ending of the war, was very, very unhappy with what they saw as the shortcomings of democracy. And that led to, if you went to a university in the 20s, you would be absolute, in the same way perhaps if one went to university in the 60s and 70s and 80s, maybe, the milieu would be radically right-wing and political, and that's what you kind of that's the water you swam in, right? And in my case, it was the opposite, wasn't it? It was left-wing politics. And all those kind of factors, but then you have the unusual circumstances of the economic crisis, which pushed democracy too far. I listened to an interesting podcast the other day, which argued that if it wasn't for the economic crises and the complete lack of willingness of the upper echelons of German society to stick with democracy, that kind of led to its fatal undermining, and that even though the Germans weren't particularly happy with Weimar, they were getting used to Weimar, and if the crisis had been dealt with better, maybe there would have been that they might have got through that. So that's an element. Then there's and I think this is all very valid. Sociology and history. There's the kind of it's not his phrase, but I don't know which historian he gets it from. The generation of the unconditional. These young men, especially who may not have fought in the First World War, but many of the killers had been fighting the First World War and then immediately went into the Freikorps and kind of come out with that already, very, very inured to both mass death and political murder. But the young men who kind of didn't go through that, Himmler would be one who, felt terrible shame and guilt at not having been part of the front line, and were not happy with anything less than completely uncompromising millennial solutions to what they saw as Germany's decline, all that kind of stuff. That's a factor. The cult of hyper masculinity, militarism, toughness, that's in there as well. But then also, the control of the state, the sanctioning of the state, and perhaps one feels, Evans feels that this was a very unusual set of circumstances which led to a sanctioning of absolutely insane contraventions of conventional morality and all this kind of thing. So okay, yeah. And that's interesting, and it's well written, it's well said. Not particularly new, doesn't tell me particularly things I didn't know or haven't thought about or haven't debated with people about kind of stuff. It's only really towards the end of the book that we kind of go into new places, because the last kind of set of chapters are of Riefenstahl is in there, so she's not a perpetrator, but she's an enabler and a supporter. Then you have portraits of two exterminators who I hadn't come across before, and their kind of case histories, and they kind of dipped in and out, etc. It's really the last chapter that is quite interesting and unusual. So we know about Victor Klemperer and his diaries and extensive diaries, but of course, he was far from being the only person keeping extensive lifetime diaries in that generation, but also in Germany. So we have the interesting case of I think her name is Louisa Solmhitz, who was a Hamburg lady who was actually married to a German officer who happened to be Jewish, but had no claims on a Jewish identity, had never been part of that community. And they were kind of, I think the phraseology was something like privileged mixed marriage. So he was never deported, but they became subject to further and further privations and sanctions, and that the life became much more difficult as the war went on, etc. But really, it's the story of how in her diaries she goes from a committed German nationalist, right-wing authoritarian, that kind of milieu, to being a passionate supporter of Hitler, but then growing more and more and more disillusioned. But his point is that does she become disillusioned with Nazism, or does she become disillusioned with the dogs, the farm dogs? Nothing I can do about it. Does she become disillusioned with Nazism, or does she become disillusioned with Hitler as disastrous military leader? And I think that's what Evans is telling us she became, not somebody who suddenly discovered a deeper, humanitarianism or love of liberty or love of democracy. And he suggests that many Germans did that. The coda to the book is really interesting because he takes that one further, and there's a very minor meeting with a German on a train going through Denmark who essentially she fled Germany because she was so outraged by the behaviour of the Nazis in the very early 30s, not long after the conquest of power, and deliberately moved to Denmark and deliberately got herself a new husband because she wanted nothing to do with that society and that state anymore. And the book ends on the question, and I think it's a very interesting, useful, pregnant question: why just her? Why were so few prepared to? I think there's another nice line, which is go from opposition to resistance. She didn't resist, but she opposed and left. So, a very well-researched book, a good book, an important, interesting book. Didn't promised a little bit, overpromised a little bit about how much new material it was going to give me. I think maybe 10% of the book I would justify that way. But that isn't me trying to slag Evans. I think he's a great, interesting commentator and historian. And I'm sure there'll be people who don't know about these kind of personalities, and he's very good at telling you that, you know, the kind of conventional narrative that these people are evil, psychopathic, deranged, damaged, and therefore kind of outside the norm. He won't have any trouble with that. Part of the point he's making in the book is they're not. They were very typical of their time. They're very typical of all of us, perhaps of modernity and etc. And that's too simple and too reductive to kind of write them off in that way, which is, the sociology and the context and that's all very, very important. I suppose ultimately the book is unsatisfying because it's an impossible question to satisfactorily answer, isn't it? Why did these things happen, and why did these people behave this way? And of course, one always is concerned about, could these things come again and be as disastrous? And what would one do in such circumstances? Now, my farmer neighbour is going to play his hour of, I think it's like Spanish football radio, so I'll stop now. I would give this book 2.5 out of 5. You know what? No, I won't. I'll go higher. I did want to keep on reading it, and I did want to keep on deep. So that's I'm more like a 4. I'll go 4 out of 5. I won't reread it. I won't keep it. I'm sure if I put it into a bookstore, people, used bookshop, people will pick it up, or a charity shop. I'm very, very happy to do that. And so, interesting, readable, informative. Not sure I agree with what he says about Goldhagen. Not sure I says what he says about Browning. But that's interesting, and the debate continues, shall we say? Okay. And the banality of evil recapitulation is interesting as well. So yeah, good. It was good. Now, I was going to do a final one tonight, Friday, but I don't really think I've got the energy. Which is I'm as part of my TESOL thing, I'm teaching Fantastic Mr. Fox, which is an excellent book, and I will probably finish that over this weekend. So with the guy, so I'll probably do a little review of that, and that'll be my next one. Then I'm gonna choose some 2 new books for the week ahead. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your time and attention. I gave you the other view instead of the mountain view. Maybe if that's okay. And thanks very much for your kind attention. Wish you luck on getting back into reading. Let's get rid of that TBR pile together, and see you soon. Bye bye. Good night.